Land is the basis of all independence.
Hello YouTube, how you doing? This is going to be another history video, and this video is going to be, kind of linking in the idea of the importance of land and how the African ancestors have always traditionally fought for their own land, because
land is the basis of all independence. Land is the basis of freedom, justice, and equality.
Land is the basis of all independence. And one of the misconceptions that I always hear, whether it's in the media, or whether it's in class, or whether it's just amongst people, just in general, one of the misconceptions is that Europeans or European Americans freed African people from enslavement. And I always there's so many issues with that statement in itself, because it's one of those things where, like, that's just such a simple way of looking at history, that one person can free another people from their enslavement, from their bondage, totally ignoring, totally just overlooking the reality of the history. One of the things that people have a tendency to do is they only recognize European law. They only recognize Euro-American law. So as far as the Africans of these days were concerned, their law was completely illegitimate. Their law was completely null and void, because their law didn't stand up to the principles that it purported to stand to. And they didn't wait on the government to liberate them, and they didn't wait on any government handouts either. And so one of the things that I try to get people to realize is that when people created free spaces for themselves by fighting for their own freedom, whether or not that enemy recognized that independence, whether that enemy recognized that land as belonging to them, the freedom fighters at that point, as long as they were sitting on that land and defending that land, as far as those people were concerned, they freed themselves. And this happened all throughout the African diaspora ever since the beginning. In fact, even if we go all the way back, see, sometimes we tend to think about the African diaspora and people freeing themselves. We want to start off in South America, or we want to start off in Jamaica, in the Caribbean somewhere. But the reality is, the first African people, I don't even want to say the first African people, because there were examples of Africans freeing themselves in Santo Domingo when they first brought slaves to that island back in the early 1500s. But these same Africans that they brought to Santo Domingo, many of whom were probably from the Upper Guinea region of West Africa and were Wolof, they were actually sent to a place what's present-day South Carolina today, near PD River. All right, and then there was a gentleman by the name of. Now, what he ended up doing is he sent his cousins and he sent these people to South Carolina to find a settlement there. Now, in 1521, when he first sent people there, the people that he sent there ended up capturing 70 Native Americans and then bringing them back, enslaving them in Santo Domingo. All right, this was a common practice that you actually saw at the time. A lot of times, not at that time, but later on, you'd start to see Europeans going to North America to capture slaves, taking them back to the Caribbean islands. Because one of the things about enslaving people is you don't want to enslave a people in their own home, because they know the ins and outs and they have connections where they are. So you capture them where they are and you bring them to another place. This is the same thing that happened with these 70 Native Americans near the PD River. This place that they would be sent to would eventually be called San Miguel de Gualdape. San Miguel de Gualdape. Now this area, eventually after a few years, they decided to bring the Africans that they were importing into Santo Domingo to this area near the PD River, present-day South Carolina, San Miguel de Gualdape. About 150 Africans were transported to, and it was here that these same Africans, they rose up and they rebelled and they escaped enslavement from the Spanish. And what they ended up doing is they ended up mixing in with the Native Americans in this area. And the Spanish in this area, with not having the labor and with experiencing all this trouble with fishing and farming and all these things, they ended up just packing their bags and leaving. So we always hear about, you know, the Roanoke colony, and we hear about Jamestown, and we hear about Plymouth, and we hear about all these early settlements where Europeans came over to the Americas and found their freedom. Well, in reality, these individuals actually found their freedom. These African individuals rose up against their oppressors, found their freedom, escaped into the woods, and we don't know what happened to them because they'd been living freely for who knows how long. Now, eventually, we'd all realize that once the English people would end up coming over to the East Coast, and it would start spreading and spreading farther and farther west, you know, they probably eventually trampled on the descendants of these people who would have mixed in with the Native American population at that point. But that was the first example of freedom. Even if you're going, this is only a couple hundred people, right? Or just a little more than 100 people, right? But even if you're looking at other examples, when you start crossing over into a place like Mexico, Africans were being imported into Mexico in such large numbers, right? In fact, most of the Africans that were being imported during during the first phase of the transatlantic slave trade, which is roughly 1500 to about 1640, most of them ended up going to present-day Mexico, present-day Peru, and Ecuador, that area there, and also into Brazil. A lot of these Africans that were being transported into Mexico in the 1500s and the 1600s, many of them were arriving in what's present-day Veracruz. And these Africans that arrived in Veracruz, they escaped the plantations, right? They escaped the gold mines, the silver mines, and they fled up into the mountains. And this is what they gave them the name Cimarron. Cimarron was a name that the Spanish used to call the runaway cattle. They used to escape up into the mountains. And cima in Spanish means up. And cimarron was the word used to describe those that ran up into the mountains, the cattle. They started to use these terms to then describe the runaway slaves that escaped up into the mountains. But there was one slave by the name of, one rebel by the name of Yanga. Okay, Yanga, he escaped up into the mountains in 1570. And then he had a band of people following him. And eventually he was able to fight off and win very, very critical battles against the Spanish military in the year 1609. And then between 1609, with all these skirmishes and scuffles between the Spanish and this Maroon community in Mexico, you would eventually see this individual eventually come to an agreement with the Spanish government in Mexico at the time. And they eventually would call this settlement San Lorenzo de los Negros. And San Lorenzo de los Negros has been existing ever since, all right? And today, this community is known by the name of Yanga. You can go next to Veracruz today, or right around Veracruz today, and you'll find the community Yanga, which are the descendants of those individuals that escaped slavery and found their own freedom.
Mata Clara, presente en el Afrofest.
If you keep going, you can keep going further down into South America. Brazil, same thing. You had the community known as Kilombo dos Palmares. This community, with the more Anglo pronunciation, Palmares, was a community of runaway slaves, same like the other ones, who escaped up into the mountains and defended their little territory. I don't even want to call it little territory, because they had about a population of about 20,000 living in there. And they defended their community from not only the Portuguese, but even when the Dutch tried to go in and enslave these individuals, they protected and defended themselves from them, from about 1600 to 1694. And this entire time they fought. And you had people that were born and died in this community as free people. All right. Now eventually the it was a confederation of Maroon communities that were bonded by a common enemy, and the common enemy was the European enslavers, the Dutch and the Portuguese. But eventually, they would experience a little bit of division within their community. There was a guy by the name of, the leader was named Yanga, who wanted to compromise the people of the community and sign a treaty with the Portuguese. And he eventually signed this treaty with the Portuguese, and Zumbi, who was another military leader, he decided he didn't want to sign this deal with the Portuguese, and he remained uncompromising, and he continued to fight for another about 14 years after Ganga signed this treaty. Now Zumbi, as a military leader, was eventually captured and killed, and the rest of the Kilombo dos Palmares eventually disintegrated, but you still found little pockets of communities in and around the Amazon area that still exist to this day. All right, so these people fought for their freedom, even though they weren't able to sustain themselves as a large community as they once were for those 100 years, but they still were able to sustain themselves out there. Also in South America, you have the Saramacca. All right, so in the late 1600s, you had a lot of Africans being imported into what was known as Dutch Guyana, in today's known as Suriname, in the late 1600s all the way into the 1700s. Now, this area, just like Brazil, is, when you go deeper into the hinterland, it's jungle. So a lot of the runaway slaves, who were Akan or Ashanti people, ended up fleeing into the jungles and ended up establishing their own communities there. And from there, they would raid plantations, fight against their oppressors, and then by 1762, the Saramacca or the Juca, these two groups eventually signed a treaty with the Dutch government and guaranteeing their freedom. To this day, you'll find a population of about 90,000 Saramacca and Njuka living in the woods in that area there in Suriname. Okay, and then also in French Guiana as well. So kind of like between those two boundaries there. So they also fought for their freedom. I mean, the list goes on. Jamaica, the same thing. They started importing hundreds of Africans from the same region, from the Akan region, from the Gold Coast region, known as the Coromantee in Jamaica. They were called the Coromantee in Jamaica because it was one of the ports that a lot of the Ashanti people used to pass through was called the Coromantee port, and as they were getting transported into Jamaica, that was just a generic term that they imposed on these individuals. But the Coromantee ended up rising up. They imported an influx of them. Once the British ended up taking over Jamaica in the year 1655, they started to import an influx of Africans from this region, and also importing Igbo individuals as well. These individuals all escaped slavery, rose up against their masters. You had sugar plantations with hundreds of slaves on them. They rose up, they fled into the mountains and created their own independent communities. And then by 1739, they forced the hand of the British colonial government to sign a treaty with them. Till this day, you find Maroon community, a free community in Jamaica. Now, there was by 1796, 1797, most of those Maroons ended up getting exiled, and they were sent to Nova Scotia, and then from Nova Scotia many of them were sent to Sierra Leone, but they fought for their freedom. Same thing in St. Vincent. I mean, the list just keeps going on and on. St. Vincent, in the year 1675, there was a slave ship that crashed on an island near the Grenadines called Bequia, and these Africans that were on the bottom of the ship had risen up, found a way to get to the mainland, St. Vincent, and then it was there that they ended up mixing in and pretty much taking over the women of the Carib Indians that lived on that island. And then from there, anytime the French or the British tried to take over that island, these people, now known as the Black Caribs, because they were mixed with the Carib Indians and mixed with the Africans that were on that slave ship with 400 slaves that crashed in 1675. They mixed together with the Caribs. They became known as the Black Caribs, also known as the Garifuna. And they defended and fought for their land and their freedom from the late 1600s all the way till 1797, until the British finally exiled them from the island. But then they end up shipping them to different parts of Central America. So you can find the descendants of the Garifuna now in Belize, You find them in Guatemala. You find them in, I think you even find them in Honduras and Nicaragua. All right, so then you find those people there as well. Dominica is another one. They had a Maroon community in the middle of the island for 50 years. They fought and defended their freedom. There is also in the United States of America, even the Great Dismal Swamp. There were they even estimated that between the years 1830 and 1860, there were about 150,000 permanent runaways in the country, right? And that's not considering the people that just run away for a little bit and come back. When you're considering that number, they say that there was somewhere around, recent estimates say that there was probably somewhere around like 50,000 runaways every year, right? But these runaways wouldn't always stay away. Some of them would return. It just depended on the situation, I guess. But the Great Dismal Swamp, you had Africans ran into the Great Dismal Swamp, which was right there between the borders of North Carolina and Virginia, where people fought and defended their freedom in those areas as well against slave catchers, all the way up until the Civil War. You had Florida. If you go all the way back to the year 1693, Florida was Spanish this whole entire time. And so when the British started bringing in large quantities of Africans, especially into South Carolina, these Africans would run down into Florida to get their freedom. Now, there was three options that a lot of these runaways had, okay? Some of the runaways would run away into Florida and then work for the Spanish government and working as military men, all right? Right outside of St. Augustine. So by the mid-1500s, St. Augustine was established, but then these Africans would run into Florida, and then they established a community right outside of St. Augustine by the name of Fort Mose. Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose is the long name of it, but the shorter name is Fort Mose. There was a town of about 100 blacks, right? They fought and defended Spanish Florida against the encroaching British that kept on trying to come down and take it over. Not only that, but you had some of the other blacks that escaped down into Spanish Florida mixed in with the Native Americans. This is where the name Seminole comes from. Remember I just talked about the word cimarron? What is cimarron? Cimarron is those who escape up into the mountains. Well, the French adopted the word known as marron. They took off the seam part. The British adopted the word. They called it maroon. But when the cimarron, plural cimarrones, ended up becoming corrupted or debased by the time it got to Spanish Florida, the cimarrones became known as Seminoles, and the Seminoles became known as Seminoles. And this is what you have. Seminole comes from the root words cimarron, which is just simply describing runaway slaves, people who escaped the plantations, people who escaped the encroaching British. So runaway people, okay? So even though the Indians weren't necessarily enslaved at this time, they were escaping the encroachment of the British Empire in the same way that the Africans were. So you had the red Seminoles and you had the black Seminoles. So you had blacks escaping into Florida, mixing with Spanish. You had blacks escaping in Florida, mixing with the Native Americans. But you also had blacks escaping into Florida and mixing with nobody but themselves, all right? And those were just the independent Maroon communities that you found all throughout Florida. Now, they fought and defended themselves for an extended period of time. So we're going to continue this on the next video with the Florida Maroons, and then we're going to go on with some other stuff, all right?
Land is the basis of all independence.